Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Chris Buskirk, friend of the show, publisher of American Greatness, amgreatness.com, has a piece over at Compact, How Republicans Sold Out America, talking about where Republicans have been over the last, the 30 years preceding Trump, and where they are today as the cohort that was largely in charge of the party pre-Trump is at odds with some of the more populist leadership of the party at present, including Trump. He writes that by the 1970s, conservative ideologues had come to advocate market solutions for just about everything. Some of those solutions made sense, but other policies proved disastrous, including free trade and financialization that led to the breakdown of the middle class, the hollowing out of the American interior, an epidemic of deaths of despair. To reverse these trends, he argues, Republicans must challenge free market orthodoxy. And he gives a couple of examples of what he's talking about in terms of his view on what constituted disastrous policies, like the Glass-Steagall Act, which allowed commercial banks to own investment banks and insurance companies and engage in proprietary trading. It was supposed to let banks compete with large foreign banks, but what he would argue, and many others, is that it actually created a too-big-to-fail environment that we all remember in the run-up to the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009. From the 1980s until 2016, Republicans sought to make U.S. companies more competitive with foreign companies. The problem was it was never possible to drive wages low enough to compete with Chinese labor, writes Buskirk. And this is where the transformation happened, he argues, where the Democrat Party became the party of the coasts, the big cities, the very wealthy, the large corporate interests, including big tech. And he reminds us that pre-Trump, it wasn't until back in the 50s when Dwight D. Eisenhower ran for president on raising the minimum wage, expanding Social Security and unemployment insurance, that a Republican presidential candidate was talking about the desirability of rising wages for the middle-income American. And this leads him back to Angelo Codevilla and where the divide is at present. And this has been argued by scholars like one of my favorites, Joel Kotkin, the author of The New Feudalism. He talks about the clerisy versus the yeomanry. Buskirk, invokes Angelo Codevilla, who's credited with popularizing, if not coining, the term ruling class, the recently departed academic Codevilla, where you really break it down into a country class versus ruling class. That was Codevilla's formulation, the ruling class versus the country class. Buskirk writes, the more important divide in America today is one between those who've captured a disproportionate share of wealth, power, and status and everyone else. The tension between the ruling class and the country class is profound, but often obscured by ruling class factional conflicts for which the country class is dragooned into action as unwitting foot soldiers who lose no matter which faction wins. And this is part of the argument that Trump made when he ran for president in 2016, wasn't it? Where you had 2 terms of a Republican president, 2 terms of a Democrat president, and 16 years of stagnant wages, which in part gave rise to a populist like Trump. So is that the right formulation for the Republican Party? Are those criticisms of free market solutions to things like American competitiveness and a robust middle class that leaves more to their kids than their parents left for them, sort of the intergenerational compact? It's a complicated question, and one that brings forth passions from both schools of thought. To get reaction to the argument, Pleased to be joined again by Don Boudreaux, who's an American economist, author, professor, and co-director of the program on the American economy and globalization at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. You can also get his musings at cafehayek.com, which is a good blog. Don, thanks for joining us. What's that?
I said you named your dog after it.
I named my dog after Frederick von Hayek, not Cafe Hayek. But yeah, close enough. Don Boudreaux, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. I love your dog's name.
Yeah, yeah. It was tough. It came down to Friedman versus Hayek, and I just thought Friedman doesn't necessarily invoke Milton, and so yeah.
That's
anyway,
I
digress.
I have a stereo once named Adam Smith. So
okay, well, there. Oh, both the first name and last name. Oh, okay, there you go.
Yeah.
I could have done that. I could have done Milton Friedman, but it's just like Milton Friedman, come here, Milton Friedman. I don't know. It would sound
come here, little Milty.
We just called him Adam. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds weird in the park, So, Don, what about Chris Buskirk's argument about things like Glass-Steagall and how that served to the detriment of middle-income families in America, rather than the promise that those sorts of ostensibly free market solutions would lead to more prosperity across income quintiles?
I wish people like that on the right and the left would actually look at the facts, which are not that difficult to acquire. There's a lot wrong in this country, but it is simply untrue, just patently untrue, that American wages have stagnated, that income, mobility across income groups has diminished. It's simply untrue that the middle class has been hollowed out. It's simply untrue that we're deindustrializing. There's no evidence for these propositions, and all the evidence points against it. I recommend to your readers who doubt me, there's a wonderful little book. It came out 3 years ago, early 2020, right before COVID, by the economist Michael Strain, who is certainly no libertarian ideologue. He's a very competent, empirically oriented economist at the American Enterprise Institute. It's called The American Middle Class. I think it's called The American Middle Class is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It. And he's got reams and reams of easily accessible data with all the sources in there that show that real wages have been rising during this time period. Fringe benefits have been rising. Income mobility is perfectly healthy. Industrialization continues apace. We Americans continue to produce a lot of things. So these people, they just get their facts wrong. They keep repeating the same fallacies. And the fallacies are so ingrained in the popular narrative that they've taken on a life of their own. Once you look at the facts, the whole story collapses. Now, it is true. There are a lot of problems with the country. This distinction that you mentioned, that Joel Kotkin identifies, I think that's real. We do have a divide between these arrogant intellectual elites and ordinary people. But that divide is largely driven now, or driven to a large degree now, by this very myth. We have people on the right and the left saying to ordinary Americans, look, you don't realize you've stagnated, and it's because of free trade, it's because of tax cuts, it's because of deregulation. And so we have to reject all those policies and return to the glorious days of the 1960s and 70s. And that gives these elites more power, far from taking power from elites, far from giving power to ordinary men and women. The very policies that these people propose would actually genuinely take more power, economic and political power, from ordinary people. So I just wish they would get their facts straight. If you get your facts straight, the whole story again utterly collapses.
But here's the problem. One of the problems is, so what do you say, let me give you a couple examples from Illinois, because I think they represent certainly the Rust Belt, but what's going on in the country generally. And I expect a Schumpeterian response from you, but we'll see. Rockford, Illinois, used to have a thriving manufacturing sector. It used to be a real manufacturing hub for a mid-sized city. Manufacturing pulled out of Rockford, and that community has not recovered since that started occurring in the 80s. Galesburg, another even smaller community. A big employer like Maytag pulls out, and and that community never recovers. And a lot of people over the course of the last 25 years leading into the Trump election saw these companies pulling out, saw these companies offshoring at least some of their operations, and said, we're losing our jobs, we're losing our livelihoods, we're losing our community. And what I see is these companies allied with the government getting benefits for offshoring economic opportunities that are more appropriate for Americans, and American politicians should be looking out for Americans.
So a couple of things. The overall health of an economy cannot be judged by what happens to a particular location. Now, I know that sounds kind of harsh. It may be that Rockford is more stagnant now than it was 40 years ago. But if you look at, and these are the only, these I submit are the relevant statistics. If you look at the overall performance of ordinary American workers, what the Bureau of Labor Statistics calls non-supervisory and production workers, hard hat workers, production line workers, non-supervisors. Across America, their wages are rising and their economic opportunities have been increasing. Again, I'm talking about pre-COVID. COVID's messed a bunch of things up. And so the people once in Rockford are now somewhere else earning higher wages to the extent that Rockford has, in fact, perhaps lost population. Farming communities 100 years ago, 120 years ago, lost population. This happens. This is inevitable in any kind of dynamic economy in which you have economic growth. Economic growth changes the location of particular activities. It changes the kinds of activities that are dominant, both in the country as a whole and in particular locations. If we try to prevent change, this now comes to the Schumpeterian part of my answer that you rightly anticipated. If you try to prevent each person from losing a job or each community from changing the tenor and type of its economic activities, then you will doom that economy to stagnation, and everybody will be economically worse off over time. And so, but again, when we look at the overall statistics, we find no evidence that ordinary Americans are suffering. If the people in Rockford, for example, were not able to find jobs in Rockford, of course, it would just be one example of many Rust Belt locations. Presumably, these people would be out there somewhere in the unemployment ranks. They would be driving wages lower when they do get jobs. We don't see any evidence of that, Dan. And one other smaller point, and fortunately, I think this point is swamped by the larger dynamism of the American economy. There are, different states, of course, do have different policies, some better than others. Illinois is not known for its recent friendliness toward investors and entrepreneurs.
You don't say.
And whereas South Carolina and Florida and Texas are. And so it wouldn't be surprising if, as the relative attractiveness of doing business in, say, South Carolina rises relative to that of doing business in Ohio and Illinois, for example, that you would find some communities in Illinois suffering job and business and population loss to these places that are more friendly to commerce.
One other challenge to the free market argument, it seems to me, is the rule of law. Markets depend on laws to enforce property rights. And so I think what a lot of people see as well as Republicans and Democrats over the last 35 years who didn't enforce the rule of law in this perhaps as the most pronounced example, border security. And so if you are creating an artificial market with respect to labor, for example, by not enforcing border security and not enforcing the border, and then you're providing benefits for people who arguably under the law wouldn't be entitled to those benefits, like even being in this country, then why should I have confidence that you're going to represent my interests when you won't enforce the law that's supposed to protect them? One
of the great enduring troublemaking fallacies that has been on the loose for quite some time is the equation of Republicans with free marketeers. Just a handful of them are, but the typical Republican is a politician.
Yeah.
I would say at the margin, generally a little bit more sensible than the typical Democrat these days, but not much more so often the case. The fact that Republicans pursue various policies, domestic and international, should not be interpreted. Those policies should not be assumed to be pro-free market. Republicans play politics, and politicians, it's just part of what they do, unfortunately. They dispense special privileges. They appease special interest groups at the expense of the larger population. They violate, in other words, the rule of law frequently. It's what they do. And so I agree with you. Republicans are not very good they're not very principled at sticking to the rule of law. They're very good at talking about it. The Democrats don't at least have given up the pretense of pretending that they favor the rule of law. The Republicans are a little bit more hypocritical, I think, now. Both Republicans and Democrats, with few exceptions on both sides, violate the rule of law. And you're exactly right. To the extent that the rule of law is violated, then the basis for a thriving market economy is threatened. It's a cancer on that. The market can take a lot of abuse, but it can't take an unlimited amount of abuse before it starts collapsing. So there's a lot of problems on both sides that are accurately described as violations of the rule of law. I agree with that.
He is Don Boudreaux, American economist, author, professor, co-director of the program on the American economy and globalization at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And again, you can also check him out at cafehayek.com, his writings at least. Don Boudreaux, thanks as always. Appreciate it.